Hi, everyone. It's Barb Egan with Therapy Talks. And on today's show, we bring to you Alissa Rumsey from New York City, who's a registered dietitian to speak on the hot topic of body image, disordered eating, body dysmorphia, and our relationship with food and how it impacts our mental health and well-being. So on today's show, we talk about intuitive eating, that working out of that framework, working out of the intuitive eating framework. We talk about self-compassion. We understand where do our eating patterns and our relationship with food and our perspectives come from? What is my body telling me? What happens with restrictive eating? Keeping the things you want in the house is actually a great strategy to start, even though it seems counterintuitive. We talk about mindfulness, shame, and self-compassion. We talk about what that practically looks like in real life. And it's so fascinating bringing in a registered dietitian's perspective onto this phenomenon that we really talk about this topic quite a bit in. It's so trendy in our lives, in our culture, and it's fantastic to hear Alissa's real life story personally and professionally. So I hope you join us. So tell us a little bit about you. Where are you? What do you do?
Yeah, so I am a registered dietitian nutritionist by training. I now consider myself more of a food and nutrition therapist, which is a title that one of my clients bestowed on me a couple of years ago. He said, my wife keeps asking me who I'm seeing. He's like, and I wasn't sure what to call you. So I told her you were my food therapist. And yeah, I've been a dietitian for, let's see, 14 years now. And my work has really evolved as I've evolved. And now I'm based in Brooklyn, New York, and I have a virtual private practice where I work with folks who are looking to heal from chronic dieting and liberate themselves from dieting and really come back to their bodies and come home to themselves and feel more connected and more unapologetic when it comes to what they're eating, but also just how they're living their lives as well.
Right, because we are what we eat, like that classic quote. Yes, I am such a big proponent of this. I mean, not only as a therapist do we see this relationship with food and body image and confidence really play out, on the emotional, mental level and physical, but I mean, it's even at the very basis of chemical level inflammation. The gut is the second brain. And it's really so correlated to anxiety, stress, depression, mental health, well-being, or mental health, not so well-being of what we eat and what we put in our bodies, and just having that really healthy relationship, that holistic approach, I am a huge advocate for.
Yeah, I think that's something that, I was trained in a very food first kind of perspective, which in and of itself isn't necessarily bad. But when you layer on top of that the different cultural and social ideals when it comes to bodies and this, healthism that's very prevalent and like wellness culture that's very prevalent. And it can be a lot of pressure. And most of the folks I work with have taken this, I have to eat, quote unquote, perfectly to this level where it's causing them more stress, right? So I always say, like, if what you're eating or how you're trying to eat is causing you more stress, that's not actually going to help you be, quote unquote, healthier. Because yeah, we have to look at health from the physical perspective, but also the mental and emotional perspective. And there is a really big interplay. Like you said, I work with a lot of people who've been, because of gut issues, been eliminating foods. And really, like, after working together, a lot of people, not that there aren't people that have true intolerances or allergies, but a lot of people, once we start working on the stress and anxiety piece of things, they're able to tolerate all sorts of foods again. So yeah, there really is an interplay. And I think our culture tends to be very much of like, oh, eliminate these foods or don't eat these foods versus like, okay, let's take a step back and see what's really going on here.
Yeah. And being in Brooklyn, I mean, I've spent a lot of time in New York City. I love New York. It's a really fun place, great place to eat too. I mean, great pizza. When I would frequent earlier in my career, I traveled quite a bit and I was in New York City quite a bit. Bagels, like the best bagels. And so I could imagine there too. And I'm American. I live in Canada on the West Coast now. But I know the culture too around food and a way to love on people, but also this tense relationship with food, primarily where you're located. And I know you're virtual, so you probably see people from all over, but you're smack dab in the city that never sleeps, of the go, 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 the hustle, the bustle, the, kind of hustle for your worth mentality. That is a lot. And I could just imagine that plays into the people that you get to work with too.
Oh, 100%, 100%. I would say, basically everybody that I work with identifies as a type A,
Yeah.
perfectionist, overachiever. Yeah. And I work with people all over the US, a lot here in New York as well. But that definitely is a common thread. And it is really interesting, right? How like that, type of, which I think, yes, I think there are some things that are inherent in us, but I also think our cultural conditioning, like living in a culture that's very individualistic focused and with capitalism, right? Like needing to produce and this focus on like doing more, 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 more. And then when it comes to people's relationship with food and their bodies, that gets impacted as well of like, well, I have to look a certain way or I have to be a certain way in order to be worthy and valuable and loved and respected. And yeah, so that's a lot of what we're unpacking in the work that I do with my clients is I kind of picture an iceberg and like the little part that's sticking out at the top is what you eat and like your relationship to food and like how you feel about your body. And people come to me, they're like, okay, I'm like really messed up with food. I need to like, whether it's like I'm binging or I'm like emotional eating and I need to fix this. Like that's what they come to me with. But then really underneath that, it's not actually a problem with food. What it is really like a problem with our culture. And it's like, okay, what conditioning have you been exposed to? What experiences have you had? What have you learned? What have you been taught about food, about bodies, about worth, about value? And so it's really kind of unpacking all this stuff that's under the surface. And, I often say, like, when I first started working in nutrition, and as a dietitian, it was very much like people came and it's like, okay, let's fix your eating, right? Let's eat more vegetables or, eat whole grains or whatever it is. Figure out like how you can cook more or whatever. And the work that I do now, yes, at some point we generally do talk about nutrition. But again, like the impact of that, like where I was going before, I was skipping over all the like what's underneath that, right? And like really unpacking and unlearning often has to come before working on shifting behaviors, because if we're not aware of what's impacting our behaviors, then we can try to change them, but it just becomes something like similar to dieting that works for a little while and then doesn't.
Yeah, we revert back for sure if we don't get at those beliefs and perspectives, which I love. And in my own story, I mean, I was an elite level athlete, played for Ohio State, came up through Team USA. And so talk about, being meticulous of what you put into your body. Even to this day, I am. My husband works in natural health, so we are very aware. And to this point in our life, it's healthy and it's not as obsessive, but as an athlete, that definitely was true. And I remember we would have team dietitians that we would work with, but it was very clinical. There was none of that of what's your relationship with food. Like we barely had sports psychology that touched on how are you or are you feeling stressed? It was more like, okay, how do we perform? It was very all of that. And so my example or my experience was we talked to our dietitian. They'd be like, okay, I remember on Mondays, we'd have to, get our body weight and our fat percentage. And I just remember I hated doing that. I hated Mondays. And if you were a certain percentage, then you had to have morning bike sprints for until you cut down. So I mean, like now I know that I'm like, that's not healthy. But like as an athlete, that was just the norm. That's what we did. Everybody hated it. And nobody felt good about yourself, even though you're like these amazing elite athletes. And so you'd go and talk to someone of like, okay, I have to cut this, or I want my body to be at this percentage. What do I eat? And it was so medical. It was so clinical. It was like, hey, you eat this at this time. No why, no information behind it. It was like very much a treatment plan or a prescription.
Yeah. Yeah. And sadly, your experience is something that I think is very common, whether you're an athlete or whether you're, just someone who's been trying to make health changes or whatever it is. It tends to be very prescriptive, and very restrictive in a lot of ways. And like you said, what that ends up leading to is this like obsession around it. The people I work with, they're like, I spend so much time thinking about food, what I'm eating, what I'm going to eat, feeling guilty about what I ate or didn't eat, thinking about my body. It takes up so much brain space. And again, when we like zoom out and think about what does health mean to us,
Yeah.
that's not very, very healthy, probably
No,
from like a
because your
mental health.
capacity shrinks so much if you're so obsessive. And then on the mental health side of it, if you're hyper focused on that thing, what you should be doing or should not be doing or should not eat, I mean, that's going to exacerbate your cortisol levels, your anxiety, stress levels. Oh, wow. You're going to have stomach issues. We often see those things, and it's so correlated, and I so see that. Even I hope there's more of a shift now in culture in general and in athletics, but obviously this is a huge part of my practice too, that I see of body image, self-esteem, confidence, worth, my relationship with food, disordered eating or body dysmorphia. And I work with RDs in town and throughout the country because I think they're so valuable members of a team to really give great care. Because sometimes you do need, obviously, a professional to say, okay, let's explore these types of good guidelines of what to eat. And that's healthy. Like when we have parameters in place, it actually gives us freedom and empowerment, but not when you're a slave to it, like you said, of the restrictive. So when people come to see you, what does that look like? Because for some of our listeners, maybe they've heard of what a registered dietitian is. Maybe they haven't. Maybe they've wondered, hey, could I benefit? Could you paint a picture of what people come to you for?
Sure, sure. Yeah, I often say that it's probably very different from what most people have in their minds of what a dietitian or nutritionist does, and or an experience that they might have had personally with a dietitian or nutritionist. So yeah, the most people who come to work with me are coming because they're struggling with disordered eating, or sometimes an eating disorder, more often than not, kind of chronic dieter, someone who's been dieting or trying to lose weight or shrink their body and kind of going in this cycle of it working for a bit and then it not working, and like this pendulum swing of like all or nothing with it. And people who are really kind of starting to be at the end of their rope of like, okay, I do not want to do this anymore. This is taking up so much of my time. I want to feel better. I want to feel healthier. I want to feel better in my body. And I don't want to like have to diet anymore, have to be restrictive. And so the work that, I'm doing is sort of, again, depending on where the person is at, there's the nutrition side of things. Like first and foremost, someone has to be eating enough and eating consistently throughout the day in order to like reconnect back with their bodies. And so we're often working on that piece of things because most of the people that I'm working with, they're eating. And again, this comes from like the diet culture that we live in. It tends to be very heavy of like, weighted towards the end of the day. So like small breakfast, small lunch, and then like dinner. And then like, oh my gosh, I just feel so out of control at night. And usually that's because they're not eating enough the first half of the day. So we work on that. I also work a lot with folks on, rather than deciding like what, when, or how much to eat based on these like external guidelines or rules or diets, it's like, okay, let's reconnect to our bodies and, really trying to support them in being able to connect more to their interoceptive cues around, okay, what body sensations am I feeling right now? And what does that tell me about what I need in this moment? So I'm trained in the intuitive eating framework. And so I do pull in some work with that often with folks and just really helping them, reconnect so that you're the driver of what, when, and how much you're eating. Now, that can be very scary for people because usually at this point, the question that I get is like, well, if I asked myself what I wanted to eat, I would just want donuts or cupcakes or pizza like all day long. That's probably like the number one question that I get. And what I say to that is, yeah, I bet you probably would. And usually that's because those are the foods you've been restricting. And so our culture tells us of like, oh, it's your problem. It's like a willpower, issue. It's a control issue. You don't have enough discipline. No, it's actually biological. And we have a lot of research to show this of like when anything, food or anything else for that matter, is off limits, our body has this physiological drive to want more of that thing. So yes, in the beginning, when you're releasing some of the diet rules and restriction, you might be eating. I mean, I had a client who had a bagel for breakfast every morning for several weeks. But then at the end of several weeks, when her body was trusting, okay, when I want a bagel, I can have it. It's not off limits. And she was, just more, she'd been having the bagel and she's like, okay, I'm kind of tired of this now.
Right.
And then you're
I've
able
had
to
my
really
fill.
tap in. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So yeah, that's, part of the process is kind of going through that. And there are stages which can be really uncomfortable. And that's why it can be really helpful to work through this with the support of a dietitian of, okay, you're not going to want bagels every morning for the rest of your life. You might want them sometimes, and that is okay. You have permission to have them, but while we're also kind of working to be like, okay, what is my body telling me? And just really like experimenting and playing with that.
Yeah. Yeah. So how do you, because a big one that I know people struggle with is, I hear that, let's go with the example, bagel or carbs, that is bad. And of course, then they were going to restrict that, stay away from it. It's like taboo. So there's often like this chemical draw towards it too, or psychological pull. How do you help someone shift out of that mentality that they could have had for years or grown up in an environment and a home as a child, even that these are good and these are bad foods? How do you shift that?
Yeah, it is a process. And to your point, it does generally for most people start in childhood, whether it's in their own home. That's actually one of the first questions I ask folks in our first appointment is like, what was food like in your house growing up? How did your family talk about food, talk about bodies? And even if it didn't come directly from their family of origin, generally by the time that they're in, honestly, like elementary school, like we start to see kids starting to diet at like fourth grade. And if not earlier sometimes, which is so sad. They're already internalizing these messages from the culture about like what foods are quote unquote good and what foods are quote unquote bad. So it's really, part of it is the unpacking of where did you learn these things? How did you get these messages? How did you internalize these messages? And then have these beliefs or these messages, have they been helpful? Have they been unhelpful? And are they serving you now? And generally what most people, there is obviously usually still a fear of like, well, if I let myself eat whatever I want, whenever I want, I'm going to just like eat these things all the time. And also they can recognize of like, okay, restricting them like hasn't actually been working because it works generally. This is like the diet cycle that we see of like restrict works for a little while. Then, and again, this is biological, nothing to do with willpower. You quote unquote, break the diet, eat all the carbs, have like a binge fest, feel guilty or like, oh, I got to like get back on the wagon, get back in control of this, restrict again. And that cycle just keeps going. So really, in addition to like unpacking those beliefs and examining those beliefs, it's also about starting to try to neutralize food, both from a thought perspective, but also behaviorally from, starting to bring back in foods. And it depends on the person. Usually, we go through and it's like, okay, what are all the foods that you keep off limits? And then either which of these feels like the least anxiety provoking to have around, or which feels like, what are you like most excited to eat again? Like what sounds like the best? So yeah, for that one client, it was bagels. I had another client, it was mac and cheese. And then it's this process of habituation as part of it, of like getting used to it being around, allowing it the permission piece, while also, because, and this is right, some CBT of like, okay, I can have the mac and cheese every night. And I'm still having these thoughts of, oh my God, this is so bad. What am I doing? All these like guilt or shame often thoughts. So it's sort of working on both of those things of like, let's shift the behaviors, see what thoughts come up and start to just bring more awareness to them and start to examine those thoughts. And again, are they helpful? Is this helping you? We always also talk about at the beginning, sort of like their why of like why they want to heal their relationship to food in their body. And it's like coming back to this, coming back to the life that you want to live. Is this thought helping you get there? So it's a process. It's not something that happens overnight, especially for people who've been dieting most of their life or have had these beliefs, like you said, ingrained since childhood. But in reality, once we can view food more as neutral, like no food is morally good, no food is morally bad, then you're really able to get to a place where you're like, okay, I have all of these options. What does my body feel like right now? Sometimes, yes, it's mac and cheese for dinner. Other times it's like, you know what? That's actually not what I want. I'm craving like a vegetable or I'm craving a different protein. And so, that takes some time. But really, it's then about not approaching nutrition or food choices from a place of restriction or guilt or shame, but rather thinking about it from a place of self-care and like taking care of oneself.
Yeah. And so I hear that and I'm like, yeah, that if I was someone in those shoes or the people that I walk with, some of my clients, they could be like, I don't want to think this way. No, it's not helpful. No, it doesn't match my why, but I'm stuck. I don't know how to change this. So what do you do then?
Yeah. I think, some of it is around, or a lot of it is around, like, especially the first couple months I'm working with someone, and depending on where they're coming from, like if they've done work in therapy before, generally they've done some of this work, usually not around the food and body image piece of things, but around like other patterns or behaviors in their lives. But it's really around bringing awareness of, okay, what are the thoughts that I'm having? Because usually most of our thoughts are more subconscious. We're not like constantly aware of them. So it's using a bit of mindfulness to like give ourselves a little space from the thought. So it's like, okay, I'm having the thought that I shouldn't have had that bagel for breakfast. I'm having the thought that that was way too many carbs. I'm going to gain weight. What am I doing? What is wrong with me? Really like separating yourself from this. And then creating some space, because generally what happens is, again, we have a thought. It's mostly subconscious. We're just like in our heads often, and we react to that thought. So we have the thought, oh my God, I shouldn't have had that bagel. What was my problem? And we react maybe by going into a shame spiral, maybe by our anxiety going up, maybe by being like, I can't have carbs at lunch or dinner because I had that bagel. We react by saying like, oh, I have to work out more tonight because I had that bagel. Rather than when we're able to like separate ourselves from the thought a little bit, then we're able to respond. So it's really using some mindfulness. And then also I do a lot of work with my clients around self-compassion, around like, okay, how can I respond to myself in a compassionate way? And there's also, and I'm sure you hear this too, like a lot of people are like, well, if I'm nice to myself, if I'm kind to myself, I'm letting myself off the hook. I won't make any positive behavior changes. And we know that when you look at the research on self-compassion, the opposite is actually the case. Shame and guilt are not good motivators for change. They keep us stuck. So if we can unpack that shame, recognize that shame, and start to replace that with a more compassionate voice, we actually are able to, again, respond from a place of kindness and compassion and think about, okay, I was really craving that bagel. That bagel tasted really good. It's fine that I had that bagel. It's okay that I had that bagel, whatever it is. And I have some clients, or a lot of clients, who often compassion doesn't come easy for them, compassion for themselves. So often what they'll do, or what I'll suggest that they do, is think about, what would a loved one say to you? Or if they have a good relationship with their therapist or with me, it'd be like, okay, in the moment, can you think, what would Alissa say to me right now about this? So a lot of it is, again, like creating some space, bringing awareness, and then like making an intentional decision to respond with compassion. While also, again, we're always kind of working with, once it's safe for someone to do so, connecting with their body signals and really noticing like what their body is communicating. Because I think that's the case for a lot of people, whether with food or just in general. Our culture really makes it so that we disconnect from our body in all sorts of ways during the day. And often it's like a survival mechanism for a lot of people. And also when it comes to those of us who have a history of dieting, and really kind of, that disconnects you, right? Because whether it's like, oh, I have X calories or X points to use. And then at the end of the day, well, I might still be hungry, but I don't have any left. So no, I'm not going to eat. Or I'm not hungry, but I have some calories left, so I'm going to eat something, right? And it causes this disconnection in so many ways from our body and our body's wisdom. So, the other part of it is that reconnecting to those signals and to what your body is communicating to you. And then how can I respond to my body with compassion? How can I honor what my body needs in the moment, when it comes to food, when it comes to movement, when it comes to rest, things like that.
What would be some examples of that? Because you're right, self-compassion, it's kind of a trendy word. I mean, Dr. Neff's, she's probably my favorite expert on this, but there's this misconception of, if I'm kind to myself, or I give myself compassion, then I'm letting myself off the hook. I'll give in again. I'm weak, or any of that, which again, our psychology research tells us actually the opposite is completely true here. Let's be encouraged by that. I love how you say, pick out someone safe who champions you, whether it's a therapist or you or a friend or family. What would they say here? But what would be some, kind of practical self-compassion tips around this topic in specifically, body image, eating, that sort of thing, food?
Yeah. I would say my go-to that I probably say multiple times a day, every day to my clients, is it makes sense that. Because I think a lot of times what happens is we get caught up in our thoughts and we start blaming ourselves of like, why did I do this? This was so stupid. I know better. Why would I eat this thing? Et cetera, et cetera. And like shaming and blaming ourselves. And instead, again, because, and I can't, this is like probably attributed to somebody, but, it's not what is wrong with you, but what's happened to you. Right. So it's always, again, we take that step back, and I'm like, I have a client, for example, who, is doing a lot of what feels like really out of control snacking at night after dinner. And again, just to pause and like compare to like 10 years ago as a dietitian, I would have been like, okay, well, what can we do to like put it in a bowl or brush your teeth, or like those would have been my interventions at the time. Now it's like, okay, like what's going on the rest of the time that's like causing this eating at night? And it makes sense that she is eating these things. When we started unpacking it, it makes sense that she's doing this because she's restricting a lot during the day, because that is her wind down time, because she realized that that's the only time of day when she's eating that she's not, in the moment at least, feeling guilty or like overthinking about it. So it's sort of like a break for her. She feels guilty afterwards. Right. So I think that's one of my go-tos, is like, it makes sense that you did this, or that your body needed more food. You were not eating enough today or the last few days, because our bodies are very wise, and they will make up for whatever it is that we need. So I think that's one of my go-to self-compassion, to frame it as like, okay, it makes sense that this, and also I think just, it's okay. It's okay that I did this, I'm working on reconnecting to my body. Every eating experience is a learning experience, is one that some of my clients find helpful. I think too, and Kristen Neff talks about this as well, about self-compassionate actions, in addition to words. So, for me too, this kind of falls into like the coping tools or self-care around, okay, what can you do for yourself? Because usually at this point, there's some stress, right? Because it's like, oh, feeling guilty, feeling like shame, like starting to kind of spiral. So self-compassionate action, like what can you do to show your body some kindness? I cuddle with my cats. That's a big one for me. You might lie down on the couch and put on some of your favorite music. You might, and I think it's Dr. Neff that talks about supportive touch, where like our bodies don't actually know. It feels funny, but like our bodies don't know if the hug is coming from us or is coming from someone else, or like stroking your arm, or like pinching your finger pads, like these things. And this is where some of the like somatic experience comes in too, right? Because, there is thought work for sure, but there's also the like embodiment piece of like, how can we show our body that we're safe in this moment?
Yeah. 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 And I love that piece. I think it's so powerful because it does, like, even just, giving yourself a hug, like not just a quick, on off, but like a real genuine embrace, or kind of just going like this, like you would a small child, kind of on their back, you're rubbing their back, and it's soothing. There's something about that, even us as adults, that it calms our nervous system, it calms our body, it activates some oxytocin in the body, that kind of calming attachment bonding hormone. It's beautiful. It makes you feel safe. And I think that's a big part of that too, because there is that tension of food, because it's everywhere. You have to have it to survive. It's not like, okay, just ignore it completely, because that's often what we do with things that make us feel anxious, is we procrastinate, but we just can't with food, because we have to survive, we have to eat it. And so it's just finding those gentle ways to face it in a really loving, safe way, because it can be so, especially around restrictive or shame, it's good, it's bad, it could be so scary. So to walk with someone who's trained in this area is huge. It's life-changing, gently facing that quote unquote fear and practicing that self-compassion.
Yeah, exactly. Something else as you were saying that I also thought about is Dr. Resma Menakem, who wrote the book My Grandmother's Hands. He's a licensed social worker, mental health therapist. And in that book, My Grandmother's Hands, it's about racialized trauma, but it's like the best book I've read just in terms of like explaining trauma to a layperson. And trauma's impact on our body. And something he said in that book that really hit home for me, he said, as a therapist, my clients think they're like coming to me to help them, fix their problems or whatever it is, be less anxious, whatever. He's like, the biggest benefit they're getting, even if they don't realize it, is being in a room with me, whether it's virtual or in a physical room with me, as someone with a regulated nervous system, and that like co-regulation, right? Of like, and that for me has been something just in the last few years, I've been learning more about nervous system work. And that has been really powerful because, and I think that's something people, and certainly I know some people who've done some of this work on their own and have gotten to a really great place. And also it can bring up a whole lot of like, your body's like, whoa, this feels really unsafe. Because usually a lot of folks, their food behaviors are something that in part developed as a way to keep them safe. Whether it was, I have lots of clients whose parents put them on diets as children. And so for them, restriction is also tied to like, okay, if I do this, then my parents will be proud of me. Then I will be seen as valuable and worthy. And even if like as adults, we can be like, okay, I know that my parents like would see me as valuable and worthy anyway, but as a child, we don't actually know that, right? Like our brains don't actually know that. And so, yeah, a lot of people's behaviors around food are as coping tools, whether that's restriction, whether that's binging. And so we can't just take that thing away. It's like, okay, how can we, work and help you to feel safe, widen your window of tolerance, as we're shifting these behaviors as well.
How did you get into this line of work?
Oh, that's a good question. I got into it. Well, just like briefly. So as a kid, I didn't think twice about what I ate. I was actually a really picky eater, which is really funny to me now. And yeah, just didn't think twice about food. Was a kid who, I was naturally thin. I was naturally in a smaller body. And so I wasn't subjected to any, either from my family or from the culture, like any negative messages about my body size in particular. But obviously those messages were still there because in high school, I hit puberty. I also stopped playing basketball and started gaining weight, which now I know that during puberty, it's normal for over the course of a couple of years for women to gain 40 to 50 pounds, like completely normal. Like that is your body technically preparing for childbirth, preparing to be able to have a child. I didn't know that at the time. And that is a statistic I think is not shared as widely as it should be. And then like many folks, like, also that's the time of life, right? Where like your peer group is super important and you want to be accepted. And so I started gaining weight and I panicked. And I started going to Weight Watchers with my mom. And so I started dieting. And so this is, the last couple of years or so of high school. I also started working out at a gym. A trainer befriended me and was giving, nutrition advice. Oh my God, I did diet pills. I forgot about that.
Right.
With like, oh my gosh, what was it? Ephedra, that like awful
Oh,
thing.
I remember that. Yeah.
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 Oh God. And like had the racing heart and yeah, it was bad. I totally forgot about that. I haven't thought about this in a long time, the diet pills. And, at the same time, I was then in a biology class in high school and I've been applying to college, like not sure what I wanted to do, but I was in this biology class and we got to the section on digestion and I was like, oh, this is really fascinating. And not realizing at that point that like a lot of my interest in that part of it was like, yeah, the body is fascinating. Medicine is like fascinating to me. And I had this overlay of some disordered eating and compulsive exercising at the time. And then I discovered that there was this career called a dietitian. And so that's really what brought me into becoming a dietitian, was actually coming from my own chronic dieting and what I didn't at the time realize this, but what I now see as like pretty disordered eating. So that continued kind of throughout my college years. And then after I became a dietitian, I moved to New York City to work at a hospital here in the intensive care units. And I think that that's what really saved me, because I think if I had taken a job at that point working in like the weight loss field or something like that, it would have just continued to fuel my own disordered eating. But I took this job at a hospital and was actually kind of surprisingly, because there's, a big team of dietitians, but almost all of them actually had like pretty healthy relationships with food. And those became my first friends in New York City. And like you said, New York is such an amazing food town. And I was like in my early 20s and just like doing all these things and experiencing it. And without trying necessarily, like I wasn't I wasn't aware, that I had any kind of disordered eating. I thought, because it's so normalized in our society, I thought it was just normal. And as a dietitian, it's also kind of normalized of like, oh, you're a dietitian, you must eat, perfectly, quote unquote.
Right.
Right.
Right. The
But yeah,
pressure. Yeah.
yeah. But being around these people that just loved food, enjoyed food, we were going out to eat a lot. Also because of like work and social life, I stopped working out as much. I was still working out, but wasn't working out as much as I was before. And yeah, over the course of like, gosh, probably like 8-ish years, I just started more kind of coming back to my body. And I actually remember like one like thing that really sticks strong in my head is, so I also in my 20s lived with a couple of roommates, and I was living with one of my really good friends, and her boyfriend would come visit us on the weekends because he lived in a different state. And he'd come on the weekends, and he knew that we loved like chocolate and ice cream and all this stuff. And he would bring all these things into our house. Where normally like we didn't keep these in the house. And at first we were like, oh no, like we don't want him to bring these things in. But he kept on doing it because he also liked them. And then he'd leave on Sunday and they'd still be, ice cream would still be in our freezer. And I remember, I don't know how many like months it probably was, but I remember one weekend or one weekday opening the freezer and seeing that ice cream was there and realizing that like it had been there for like a week and I hadn't even thought about it. And I said, whoa, this is really wild, because I always kept it out of my house because I said like, well, if it's here, I won't stop eating it. I'll just finish the pint or I'll finish the bag of chocolate. So that was like a really big like realization of like, oh, wow, I'm now just used to this being here. It's been here. I haven't even thought about it. Um, yeah, yeah. So again, that wasn't on purpose. That was because he was bringing the food each weekend. But and then soon after that, I discovered the intuitive eating framework, and which is a framework that was created by two dietitians in the 90s. And I started doing some training on intuitive eating and realized of like, wow, this is really what I've personally gotten to without, not necessarily intending to, but kind of over the course of that, like 8 to 10 years. And so and then also at the time I had started my own practice and I was doing more like weight loss counseling, but from this place of like mindfulness and like mindful eating for weight loss. And I took this intuitive eating course. And in the first workshop, Evelyn Tribole was presenting the research on like all about like weight science and a lot of like what we've talked about here today. And it just partly it blew my mind of like, how have I been a dietitian at this point for almost 10 years and not learned any of this? And also when I was thinking back both to my own experience as well as to the experience of clients I had worked with up until that point, I was like, oh my gosh, this makes so much sense. Where we would work together, they would lose the weight, they'd go off on their own, and like inevitably in like 6 to 12 months, they'd be back with like, oh, like life got crazy. I'm doing so bad, quote unquote. I need your help again. And I was realizing, I was like, oh, like this has nothing, like it is not their fault. Like they're not doing anything wrong. Again, biologically, that's how our bodies are set up. Our bodies are set up to keep us alive. And when restriction is happening, or it even thinks that restriction or starvation is coming, it does all these different things to try to keep our body safe. Right. So like decreases our metabolic rate, it increases our cortisol, it increases our appetite. And this happens even, those of us who are now like food secure and have plenty of food, our bodies are still wired from thousands of years ago when food was really scarce. So yeah, I just had this like huge aha moment and completely switched the work that I was doing, or like the direction that I was kind of going in, and started practicing from a weight inclusive place. And then, also I think too, like there's things that, it also caused me to question like, oh, like, am I doing this from an intuitive place of listening to my body? Or is this kind of like a cultural conditioning piece? So kind of continuing to question that myself too.
In the intuitive eating framework, can you describe that for our listeners?
Sure. So the intuitive eating framework, as I mentioned, was created by two dietitians, and they're on the fourth edition of the book, which came out, I think, 2 years ago. And the first edition of the book, it's evolved over time. So the first edition is pretty weight centric, like it's still kind of focused on do this and you'll lose weight. And they've evolved over time, and it is now what I consider a weight inclusive approach, meaning, you know, you can implement some of these things or practice some of these principles, and your weight's going to fall where it's, where it may. We all have like a set point weight range. So basically, the intuitive eating framework is a set of 10 different principles that all kind of work individually and together to help people really reconnect to their body. So a lot of what I was speaking about before, about like reconnecting to your body cues, to feelings of hunger, fullness, satisfaction, to questioning these different beliefs that you've internalized, to starting to reject diet culture, reject, okay, I'm going to stop counting calories or stop, tracking certain things, or, start to add back these foods to my diet that I've, kind of put off limits. And so, yeah, it's a framework in the sense that, it's not 10 steps. It's not something to like implement and do quote unquote perfectly. Also, there are some, it was created by two white women. And so I think there are certain principles that might not be like most applicable for everybody. But I think it's something that a lot of people find really useful just as a way, especially, coming off of dieting and being used to rules. I think people sometimes find it helpful, even though my goal is always to get away from frameworks in general, like the end point of like not having a framework. But a lot of people find it as like a stepping stone as they're moving away from dieting to be helpful.
There's some guidance in that. It's not so overwhelming.
Yeah. Exactly. And they have a companion workbook that has a lot of different exercises and things like that can be helpful for folks too.
So if that would resonate with anyone, how do they look more into that? Do they have to work with a therapist or a registered dietitian to work through that? Could they get the workbook on their own?
Yeah, so the book and workbook are available. It's the Intuitive Eating fourth edition book, and then it's the Intuitive Eating workbook. They also, on their website, intuitiveeating.org, have a list of certified intuitive eating counselors, which can be a place to start if you are looking for a dietitian, and they have them all over the world, which is really cool. And then my book, Unapologetic Eating, what I was really trying to do with my book was sort of link intuitive eating to all the other work that I do with my clients. So we've talked about like mindfulness and self-compassion and building this awareness, building this lens for being able to zoom out and be like, okay, how did my cultural conditioning impact me? Like, where did some of this come from? And so that's what I really tried to do with my book, and working in like the body image work and the like sitting with feelings and these things that like come up in this process. So my book, Unapologetic Eating, also kind of covers intuitive eating, but within this bigger umbrella of like all the unpacking and unlearning that we've been talking about.
Right. I love that framework of your, intuitive eating framework I'm familiar with. I love that. I love just what you shared, how you bring in the other parts of it too, within the window of tolerance, learning to sit in those distressing feelings and knowing that you can tolerate it, that you don't want to jump out the window of getting out that window of tolerance, but learning that you're capable, learning that you're worthy, sitting with it, mindfulness, self-compassion, those are where it comes from. Like just bringing some understanding is very empowering too, not in a judgmental or regretful way, but in a very enlightening way, because if we know, then we can make choices or direct our path from there. So I love that. Where can we find your book?
So my book, Unapologetic Eating, is available wherever books are sold. So it's on Amazon, it's on IndieBound Bookshop. It's also on Book Depository for those who are outside of the US or Canada. And it's available as both an ebook and an audiobook too.
Awesome. Great. And where can we find you? Like, how can we follow along with you?
So my website, alissarumsey.com, is a great place to start. I have more resources. I have free resources. I have some paid resources there. And then also Instagram is where I'm most active and where I share more information. So that is at Alissa Rumsey RD. And then I also send out a bi-monthly-ish email called the Unapologetic Life. So that's also where you can get just other like tidbits and stories and tips and reflection prompts on unapologetically eating and living. And you can sign up for that at alissarumsey.com/subscribe.
Awesome. Oh, that's awesome. That is fantastic, Alissa. Thank you. And as we close today, one, just thank you so much for coming on and sharing your story and your wisdom that's been birthed out of that and how it's evolved. I love that. You are just so on the ground and flexible and morphing. You're pivoting with real life, real people, real culture. And that's incredible. I love that. I commend you for that. Do you have any tips for our listeners, like some tangible, even to lean into this week? Like, what's one thing they can do if any of this resonated with them?
So I would say just starting to notice, not necessarily trying to shift your behaviors yet, but just starting to notice what you notice. What are some of the thoughts or feelings that are coming up when you're choosing certain foods? What's impacting what you're choosing to eat or when you're choosing to eat? What impacts how much you eat or what you eat? And just starting to notice what might be playing into that. I would also encourage you, if it feels comfortable, to start thinking about, some of what we talked about today, about what experiences you've had in your past that might have impacted your current relationship to your body. We didn't really get into this today, but I go into it. It's in the first chapter of my book, of the different systems of oppression in our society that affect marginalized individuals, and how dieting is actually really part of that, and how that's connected to these bigger systems of oppression. And I know for me, that was like a big light bulb moment to realize that. And that also, when we talk about kind of like zooming out and seeing the bigger picture, that's been really empowering for a lot of my clients to recognize too. So if that is of interest, again, my book Unapologetic Eating talks about that. You can also, Dr. Sabrina Strings has been on lots of different podcasts talking a little bit about that too. I highly recommend her work. And yeah, just starting to notice what you notice. And I think that is where I would say to start. And then eventually, behaviors might start to shift. If you're like, oh, I get hungry at 11 a.m., but I don't eat anything until 1. Like, why is that? And like, can I, whether it's like have a bigger breakfast or have a snack when I get hungry at 11, and just starting to see like, how can you honor your body's wisdom and start to lean into that.
Yes. Oh, I love that. Well, Alissa, thank you again. Thank you for coming on and sharing just your heart, your story, your expertise. We really value that. And thank you again.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. This is a great conversation.